Dear God, we're here, we're excited, we're grateful to be your sons and daughters. We're grateful because we have the best news, the best message in the world. Please help us to be good stewards with that, to share it with others. Thank you for your word. Thank you for letting us learn little lessons from seemingly small books that are kind of weird in some ways, some places. Thank you for this opportunity. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen. We are in chapter 9, and I wrote down verse 25. We're in verse 25, which means we have like 8 verses, and we're done with all of Esther. So, well, I hope 8 verses, my math, whatever. Game plan for tonight is I wanted to quickly, as quickly as we want, finish up 9, and then all of chapter 10, all 3 verses. And then I have a little timeline that if they're gone, I might have one extra copy somewhere too. And then I have a couple things I wanted to go through, just a quick overview. And then we'll surely be over time by then. Like, probably won't get through all that, but who knows, maybe we will. So, going right into it, verse 25. But when it came to the king's attention, real quick, I'm going to read in verse 24 because it kind of completes the whole idea. So let's rewind. Verse 24. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and it cast Pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. And again, this idea of hanged on the gallows is probably not hanged, it's probably impaled on a pole. Probably impaled on a pole. I wrote down, does this verse, question 1 under this verse 25 is does this verse repeat what has already been written? Yes. And here's the main point. Haman was hanged on the gallows, and it's 9 months later. 9 months later is when all his sons get hanged on the gallows. So it helps me just to have in time to see the gaps and stuff. So his sons were executed 9 months apart from their father. Verse 26. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. And because of the instructions of this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them. 27. The Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. Who are the ones who allied themselves with the Jews? We've mentioned this 2 other times. It's that fun word. Proselytes. Proselytes, that's right. And those are, again, not all people who are Jews today were born Jews. So proselytes are the ones who allied themselves with them. And then...
the ones that are almost Jews?
Almost Jews. No, they're Jews, I guess. Oh. Just not by blood. Not by blood, yeah. They're, how would you say it? Like not as a genealogy, not as a nationality, but as a religion, maybe, or something close to that.
So what's the difference between a proselyte and a Samaritan?
A Samaritan is a mix between Jew and Gentile, right? So technically, Samaritans are probably more Jewish. Technically, that's probably the difference. But again, it's an attitude, not anything to do with genes. Yeah, more of a faith thing, right? Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense? Oops, I can't say it any other way, so I hope it makes sense. For what purpose did the Jews establish and make this custom to observe Purim? And there's something really important. Why would you make a big deal about remembering it? I would say...
It was the Jews that were saved.
Yeah, and the whole, because they're saved, I would say because it was important. It's important, so have any of you, when you were younger, I don't know, just kind of ignored something and your parents pulled you aside and said, that's important? You ever had something like that happen? I feel like that's happened quite a bit in my life. I don't know, this is kind of an excuse, I think, for, hey, this is something that's really important, and I mean, without this whole scheme of this whole book, all the Jews are dead. They would all be dead. So it's very important. And because it's important, they want to remember it in a certain way. To kind of emphasize this, do you guys remember how the book of Exodus starts? I didn't look this up. I should have looked it up a little better than I did. Remember how the book of Exodus starts? But there's like one of the first lines in the book. I could be way off here, but I think it's the first couple lines. It says, "Now there was a Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph." And since this is a little bit of a stretch, forgive me, but because he didn't remember how great Joseph was and what he did for not just Egypt, but for all these other people, what happened to the Israelites? It's important to remember things. So, I wrote that down because I think emphasizes in a way that I can understand at least why it's important to remember some of these big deals. And this would be a big deal. Verse 28. So these days were remembered and celebrated throughout every generation and every family, every province, every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. The impact here and the reason why this is worded the way it is, I think, is because a couple times now, this is twice, at least twice in the book, we've come across what's sealed with the king's ring is irrevocable. And so I think it uses the words not to fail from their descendants in a way that kind of signifies it's irrevocable. I think that's why it's worded the way it is. So they would remember the emphasis of that. Was the feast commanded by law? Reading this, I would say yes. But no. It is not, because God's law. Good, thank you. Whose law? No, not God's law. We all, but I'm going to pick on the Jews, but we all get in trouble for having our own law as opposed to God's law. And this was a spontaneous celebration for God's people, for how faithful God is with his promises, but it was not commanded by God's law. God's law is back in first by Pentateuch, and he has some feasts laid out that they are not to fail to, and that is something that is commanded by God's law. This is not. Verse 29, then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews in 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed time, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for the times of fasting and lamentation. Question 1, is Esther authorizing a time of fasting in conjunction with the Feast of Purim in these verses? Yes. Why?
That's what they did.
That's
Going to the king.
Yeah. A lot of times there's some symbolism behind, like a feast, or behind gift giving, or behind whatever. And I think that's a big reason why they did that, is because they wanted to remember what exactly happened. Well, what happened? Or another example would be like with the Passover and stuff. How they remembered how God passed over with certain things, with the lamb and the. But this is to remember how they fasted. Mordecai came in tears, persuaded Esther. What did Esther do? She fasted for 3 days, and all the Jewish community fasted for 3 days. So this is they're fasting the day before the feast to remember this. makes the feast all the better. You know, like, I'm really hungry. Verse 32, the command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. What is the significance about the phrase, the command of Esther?
She was a queen.
She was a queen. What'd you say?
Well, it was more than because obviously the queen before didn't have any real power.
Okay,
This
okay.
time around, though, Queen Esther and Mordecai
Uh-huh.
have power.
Okay. The queen,
Authority
power,
is really the
authority.
right word.
Yes. No other time that we know of in the Bible did any time ever did a woman write a command that was followed through with. Command that still stands today. And it shows a difference, and I want to be careful how I say that because I don't mean that to sound put downy or anything like that. It's not at all. It has a shift in. I think it makes the Bible all the more special because most of the time, first of all, most of the time in any ancient book, especially, if it mentions a woman, that's surprising. You know, like it doesn't even go that far. Very belittling. And most of the time in the Bible, the importance of biblical women like Sarah and Hannah lies with their motherhood. But this shows a difference. Esther, it wasn't just like, it was more than that, which makes you kind of lean in and go, wow, you know, tell me more about this. She wrote with authority. So, I don't know. I like that. People rip on the Bible and they have no reason to rip on it. Yeah. Question 2, what is the book that it's talking about here?
Book of Xerxes.
Books of Xerxes? Could be. I'll just go ahead and say there's people think there's about 3 different ones, and I don't know which one it is. So there's the book of the Chronicles of the King. Could be that one. There's the book the book was a record of Mordecai. There's a book of the record of Mordecai. And then some people think it's the book of Esther. And I don't know which one it is. I don't know. But I wanted to bring it up that there's 3 different ones. And we're in the next chapter we're going to get to, the book of the Chronicles, or is it the book of the Chronicles? To verify the book's accuracy in verse 2 of chapter 10, it challenges the reader to verify it with the book. And that book's gone. We can't really verify it. So at the time of this writing, it was around, but now it's gone. Okay, there's 2 lessons I wanted to mention before we move on to chapter 10, all of chapter 10. And the first one is the consequence of a man's evil is often suffered by his offspring. Often suffered by his offspring. We can learn this lesson by looking at Haman, especially in this chapter, because Haman's been wicked this whole time. And everything he's been doing, we're like, wow, how insecure is this guy? Wow, how terrible is this? But his kids are all pay the price for it. And then the second one is a more upbeat one, memorializing great victories of justice with holidays is beneficial for future generations. Those are 2 lessons we learned from this chapter. And also, just to throw one in, it's not in your notes, is one of the best ways to express gratitude for providential deliverance is by giving gifts to the poor. They did that in this feast. That's in verse 19 and verse 22 of chapter 9. Okay, we got a long one here. I think I'm going to read all 3 verses and then make a couple comments, and then we're going to go straight to the last 2 things we have. So buckle in. Here we go. Chapter 10, verse 1. Now King Xerxes laid out tribute on all the land on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? That book's gone. But apparently they were written. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Xerxes, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, and who sought to do good to the good of his people, and of one who spoke of the welfare of his whole nation. A couple comments. I think verse 1, I think this chapter is talking about the success of King Xerxes and how much Mordecai helped him become more successful. Verse 1, it's kind of a weird statement to make about tribute, about how he laid tax on the whole land. And what's been suggested is that because Mordecai influenced him as a second in command, it's better to lay a taxation on your people than to plunder them. And I think that's where he went with that. It's just kind of an oddball verse to me. But that, and then also, 2, I think this chapter makes a very big statement of having godly people in your life makes you prosper. I think having godly people in your life makes you prosper, not necessarily financially. And be careful about that, because who cares about finances really? Yeah, bless, curse, curse. Yeah. Why does having godly people in your life make you prosper? I want to say because God is faithful. Pardon me. Because God is faithful. I think it's all of the book of Esther, when we come to this final point about the greatness of Mordecai and how the whole land prospered from him, I think that's because God is faithful. I think that's, if we learn one thing, God is faithful. So, we made it through the whole book. Did everybody get one of these? If not, I have this one, and someone can have it if they want it. One of these, and timeline. What helps me a lot, and what I want to point out on this timeline that you have, is I have a couple of the books of the Old Testament, like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and then we have Nehemiah, Ezra, and it helps me put it in perspective of, okay, this is all happening around the time of, well, just before Ezra, just before Malachi, but after Haggai and Zechariah. So it helps me with that, so that's why I put those up there. Also, Daniel lived probably from 620 to 540 BC, around there. So this is all happening after Daniel. What I wanted to do, if you have a pen, I wanted to give you some references on this timeline. So, if this is a little sloppy, I apologize. But the 483 BC, that's chapter 1. Oh, pens. Yeah, they're around here somewhere. Okay. First box is chapter 1. Chapter 1 specifically, verse 3. That's the party that happens. And it's between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's about 4 years-ish, around 4 years. In chapter 2, when Queen Esther is crowned queen, is chapter 2, verse 17. So understanding that between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's a whole battle that happens. King Xerxes goes out to war, fails miserably, comes back, and then gets another queen. Also, next one is 475 BC, Haman's promoted. That's chapter 3, verse 1. So between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, there's another 4-year gap. Another 4 years there. Next one, Haman issues his decree. He gets really mad, throws a little temper tantrum. Well, I'm going to seal this decree and pay off literally tons of silver to 300-ish tons of silver to go kill all these Jews. That is about a year later. I get a little confused with the months because they are specific with the months, but that's a little bit later. But that's chapter 3, verse 12, and that's 474 BC in the month of Nisan. Good car, to some people maybe. And then the decree is issued. He's ruling per during that time. They issue the decree. And then we have about 5 chapters before Mordecai's decree happens. And that is happening, all 5 of those chapters are happening in about like a 3 to 5 month period. It's a very small period. And that's when Mordecai issues his decree is chapter 8, verse 9. So from chapter 3 to chapter 8 there, It's not a whole lot of time, but it's a whole lot of buildup because there's weeping, there's fasting, and then there's a very patient queen making feasts and a lot of good meals, which might not have been good meals because what did they do for most of the time in their feasts? How do they describe their feasts? Just drinking, pretty much just drinking, yeah. So take back the food comment, I'm sorry. And then in 473, in the month of Adar, the Jews defend themselves. That's chapter 9, verse 1. I wanted you to have that. If anybody wants this one afterwards, you're free to have it. I can always make more copies. Okay. Last thing I would like to do is I would like to go chapter by chapter with you all. We have about 10 minutes. And I'll move out of the way of the board a little bit better here. So, lessons we learned from Esther, chapter 1. Who can tell me what this is? Remember what this is about? Civil legislation cannot replace love and respect. Why did we learn this lesson?
Vashti was
What?
saying no.
Vashti said no, and what did the king do to make it happen so no woman will ever say no to a man ever again? He got rid of her, he made a spectacle out of her, and he took his signet ring and made a decree that every woman, first of all, the man of the house will have the language of the house. And the women will love and, I'm saying love and respect, well, the women will serve their man no matter what. Can civil legislation make that happen? So dumb. So dumb. So it cannot happen. That's lesson 1. That's chapter 1 lesson. Silly. Chapter 2, we learned that blessed are those who care for orphans. Why do we learn this? Mordecai. Yeah, Mordecai. Esther is technically an orphan. Her parents are dead, and Mordecai takes her in like her father. And we see that he is very much a father figure, like in more than just an obligated way. It seems like he genuinely cares for her, which is very impressive and speaks to his character. And the other thing we learn in chapter 2 is plotting violence on others usually returns in violence on the plotter. Why did we learn that lesson? Does anybody remember? Well,
Before that, he built one for Mordecai.
no, it's before that.
The plot on the king's life.
The plot on the king's life is what chapter 2 is talking about. Yeah, Mordecai saves the king, and that's a big deal for later. Big deal for later. But he speaks multiple languages, we think, and because of that, he overhears them talking about the plan to kill the king and reports it to Esther. Esther reports it to the king and says she heard it from Mordecai, and the king's life is saved. And this,
interesting. Sorry, I was going to say if he didn't do that, like
he's dead later.
yeah, the entire book wouldn't have been written, right? Because Haman was on his way to ask for his head.
Yeah, we don't learn about why this is so good until chapter 6. But because of this, because the king can't sleep one night, his life is saved from those gallows. So plotting usually returns in violence. We can learn a lesson about that today. Yes. Chapter 3. Some people will compromise, if that's spelled right, the most fundamental humaneness for a bribe. In the way, for a bribe is what it says. Why did we learn a lesson about that?
Silver.
The silver. How much silver? I forget the number. 10,000 talents, which is how many tons? Like 300-ish tons of silver. It was about, what was it, 3/4 of the whole Persian Empire's income for a year for a bribe. And did the king even ask who the people were? Didn't even care, because saw some money. Yeah. Don't be like that. Me, don't be like that. You, don't be like that. Chapter 4. I really like this one. Great biblical heroes and heroines were made, not born. And We're as human as all the rest of us. You look at Esther, you look at Mordecai, they're normal people. Especially looking at Esther, you can see she's just a normal, good-looking lady, as far as we can tell. And she really stepped it up. She was terrified. She's like, well, what did she say? If I die, I die. If I die, I die. I'll do it. And Mordecai, what did he tell her? If you don't do this, you're not going to get in God's way. Someone else will stand up. And two, you will not reap the rewards. Great biblical heroes were made, not born. That speaks to me a lot. It speaks to me a lot. You ever feel like you're not good enough to do whatever it is, fill in the blank? God can use people way worse than you, like way less talented, way whatever. That's an encouraging one for me. Chapter 5. Human glory can never be satisfied. You guys remember that guy named Haman? We've talked about him a little bit already. Haman had a problem. A huge ego problem. This one guy, I'm second in command of the whole kingdom, and I didn't even see this one guy not bow down to me. I heard about it. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kill all the Jews. Come on. Human glory, or maybe ego would be a better term here. Human ego can never be satisfied. Sometimes, urgent situations call for patience.
I don't like that one.
That's a hard one. That's a really difficult one. Why is that up there?
She don't want it to know it.
Yeah.
She wants to think about
And not just that, too. It's even more than that, because Esther, she fasts for 3 days after hearing this urgent news about all her people going to die. After she fasts for 3 days, she goes in, risks her life to the king. The king holds out the scepter. She's alive. She made it. What do you want? What do you want? What's your plea? Up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you. What does she do? She has a party. She doesn't tell him what she wants. And she leaves him hanging.
Because she could read the room.
She could read the room. She could read the room. Leaves him hanging, and then invites him to another feast. Well, I'll tell you tomorrow. Leaves him hanging again. He ends up asking 3 times before she tells him what she wants, which, wow. I guarantee you that's a man who's not used to being made to wait. So, urgent situations sometimes call for patience. Because she was patient, did God let her have not just a good time to tell, an even better time? Remember how Haman was literally falling on her, pleading for his life when the king came back? The timing was just perfect after that. So that's an important lesson. Chapter 6 goes back to chapter 2b. The good we do, though unrewarded at first, will always have a return. Sometimes not in this life. Sometimes not in this life. Because the good that Mordecai did, this whole thing worked together perfectly. Because if he wouldn't have done that good, he probably would have been killed that morning, because Haman was going to get his permission to kill Mordecai. When the king says, what should I do? I haven't slept tonight. What should I do to honor the man that I favor? Well, who else can it be talking about but me, Haman?
I really
Parade him around on the horse. Yeah.
I really like that too, because sometimes you think I've really tried hard. Where's my reward? Your reward may be coming a lot later.
Thank you for reminding me about that. How many years apart?
Yeah.
About 5 years? I think it's about 5 years. I don't have it on there, I don't think. I think it was 5 years. 5 years later. The kings can't sleep one night, so they're reading the chronicles of the king, reading about him or whatever, and reads about what Mordecai did 5 years earlier. If it's 4, forgive me, but I think it's 5. 5 years earlier. Man.
If Mordecai is an opportunist, he could have not said anything about the plot, just hoping that the king would be killed. And then he wouldn't be innocent. He wouldn't be guilty of killing the king because somebody else did it. But then the same problem would have happened. Haman
Still have your
would been
number 2
alive,
guy around.
and he would have had no reason not to get his way of killing all the...
He wouldn't have to ask permission, probably.
Yeah, he probably could have just done it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this really makes the whole thing work again, the whole book again. Chapter 7. Evil people who harm others unjustly must be identified. This is when Esther points out what Haman did. And it goes, he's having a great day to a terrible day to a worse day to the worst day. It just... And the proverb, he who digs a pit will fall into it. He who rolls a stone up will fall back on himself or whatever. I wish I would have wrote what proverb that is down, but I forgot to, and it's in my notes now. It's too far to find. It's all the way over there. Chapter 8, civil power may be used for good. I really like this when we think about this. Civil power cannot replace. Even though we've seen civil power used terribly throughout this book, we get to chapter 8 and we see that it can be used for good. It's a good reminder for us today, too. It can be used for good. Chapter 9, consequences of the evil people are often suffered by their offspring. Haman's sons died 9 months after him by, again, impaling on poles. Brutal. And throughout all this, we see in chapter 10 that God is faithful. Any questions? We've gone over by 2 minutes, so I will pray now. Dear God, thank you. Thank you again for your word. Thank you for your son, the whole reason why we're here, what we do, because of you, because of Jesus dying for us. Thank you for that motivation. Please spur us on as we go from here. Please help us spur each other on. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.